Welcome to What's Cooking with Renee. I am Renee, and I have a special guest in the studio. I have Robbin Itkin, and she's a financial specialist. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now tell us more about yourself, background history. Where are you from, city and state?
I'm from Los Angeles.
Nice.
And I've lived here all my life.
Okay.
Moved away for a few years and decided to come back, and so went to all my schooling here, became a lawyer almost 30 years ago.
Okay.
And specialize in financial restructures, bankruptcy, and out-of-court workouts.
Nice. Now, what was your childhood like?
Childhood was great. It was great. Yeah.
What schools did you go to here in Los Angeles?
I was in Canoga Park.
Nice.
I went to Canoga High.
Okay.
It was a great school. Really enjoyed it. Very active there. Then went on to I went on to UCLA.
Okay.
And then to cover all sides, I went to USC Law School. So
nice.
I can cheer for all schools.
Bruins and Trojans.
You got it. That's right.
Now, we want to talk more about what you specialize in, and it's very interesting. You specialize in financial reconstruction and also bankruptcies, and you deal with married couples and the way they handle their money. Can you talk more about your expertise in that?
Sure. Yeah, I do financial restructures, which is people and companies, a lot of companies having financial issues. How do they restructure those problems? How to restructure the debt so they can afford to pay their obligations and hopefully stay out of bankruptcy.
Okay.
And sometimes you need to put them in bankruptcy in order to restructure this. Couples tend to have a lot of issues. When things aren't right financially, it also affects relationships. And so usually when there's financial demise, there's a relationship demise. And what I call financial infidelity is when there's, either in a business or a personal setting, there is a lack or refusal to realize what's really going on and acknowledge what's going on with the finances, and also to hide and be clandestine with your finances with another spouse or partners when you're in a business.
Now let's talk more about that, because I have a perfect scenario. I know someone who's been married for about 10 plus years, and they have 5 kids together, and I was just talking to the wife, and she's like, oh, I spend without my husband's acknowledgement all the time, most of the time, because if the husband was with her, he would say, we don't need this, we don't need that, we can do without this. So can you speak more about married couples and how couples, they pay for things separately without the other spouse knowing?
It's pretty common. I mean, a lot of couples, it also depends if you have 2 working spouses. But if you have one working spouse and the other one's spending the other spouse's money, there's an entitlement or a feeling of right to control where those funds go. And there are a lot of women who hide what they buy. They tiptoe upstairs at night with the bag in their purse or something so the spouse doesn't see it. But there's also spouses who do things that are even more unbelievable, and that is go buy another house for yourself without your spouse knowing about it.
Oh my goodness.
And maybe planning to leave that spouse or do something at a different time. A lot of people, out of fear and insecurities, do things that most of us would never think of doing. They may harbor cash and do things because they think that maybe their spouse will leave them one day and not treat them fairly. So they, in turn, try to take money and build it up and kind of have a nest egg in case they're, and it's obviously this is a problem. It's a problem with the relationship, a problem with communication. And so it's a problem that people need to face and deal with if that's really happening.
Now there's some legal aspects involved in this. Can you explain more about?
Sure, we can just touch upon, there are in the family code, in California Family Code, has specific sections that talk about when you have community property, and California's a community property state, so spouses share the assets. If you're going to try to dispose of those assets, encumber those assets, do something with those assets, you need to have your spouse also approve it. And there's supposed to be a fiduciary duty of mutual respect and disclosure amongst couples, just like you would expect in the business context. Now, obviously people breach that all the time. You just gave a good example of that. so you can sue your spouse. I mean, it does lead to lawsuits. Usually, obviously, where this becomes a big issue is in divorces, when you can point to one spouse who hid assets, or when they're trying to do a dissolution agreement, and later they find out that a particular one of the spouses had assets they didn't tell the other spouse about, so it wasn't really a fair split like it's supposed to be. Okay. So this happens, but you know, it happens, and it happens in the world as well. I had a very prominent client who owned properties, and he needed to file a bankruptcy for a lot of reasons. And one of the questions is, do you lease any property? Do you own the property and you lease it so you're getting income, right? That the creditors should know about, because then they should get a piece of that later on when you're making distributions. And I asked that question. I was told, no, I don't lease anything. I don't have anything that I lease. Well, it just so happened to be a couple months later, I was at a party. And I was at a party, and there was an actress there talking to somebody else, very well known, talking about this great place that she's leasing. And they said, oh, wow, where did you find that? And she mentioned, well, I'm leasing it from so-and-so, who happened to be my client, who told me he wasn't leasing any property. So unfortunately, people, when they're you know, you've talked to that addiction specialist, and when people have fears or they're having issues, they do things that a rational person really wouldn't do. And when someone's afraid about everyone's going to take their money, or they do things, it's not a license to do it. They shouldn't do it, because all this comes back to haunt you later on. The spousal issues will come up in a divorce, and you'll be penalized. If you lie to a court or on your schedules in a bankruptcy, you're facing some big issues. And you know, people don't forget these things. A lot of times, if you have financial issues and you're honest with people about it, they'll respect it and just figure you move on. But if you aren't honest with them and they feel that they've been lied to or you've defrauded them, they'll remember that and they won't do business with you again.
Now let's talk about the do's and don'ts. Just, you know, we have married couples out there all the time. So let's give the married couples the do's and don'ts from a legal specialist, you know, a legal financial representative. You can kind of narrow it down, because you see a lot of scenarios. Can you tell us some do's and don'ts? And also, I want you to give us more stories.
Okay. So do and don't. One do is clearly seek professional. When you're dating someone, obviously you're not going to enter into an agreement. But if you're really getting serious with someone, you need to, maybe through lawyers, find out what each other's assets are. You would want to do an agreement, a prenuptial agreement before you get married, and understand what you have. Number one is understand what you have. Number two, for women especially, don't be dependent on another person. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of my friends who have gotten divorced in the last few years, they're the ones providing support for their spouse. The men are the ones who don't have as good of jobs as the women do. So it really works both ways. Both men and women should not have to rely on somebody else for anything. And if you do, then you make sure up front you get that protection. And you can't let it just go and think, oh, they'll take care of me later on. Things happen, people change, and they grow apart. One interesting story I had is a woman came into our office with a huge diamond ring. And she said her husband left her, and she had no money. All she had was that diamond ring, and so she was going to use that diamond ring to support herself, because it was thought that it would be worth several $1,000,000. She went to have it appraised. It ended up being a cubic zirconium. So this woman was with this man, and he had given her this ring, and she had never any idea. So she came. She really had to file a bankruptcy because she had nothing, and so she really needed to cleanse her record and cleanse her debts that way. So, you know, unfortunately, it all goes back to greed and trust, and you need to be able to trust someone. But as much as you think you can trust someone, from a lawyer's perspective, you should never totally trust anybody. You really need to make sure you know what's going on and protect yourself.
I definitely want to bring you back on the show and have some married couples out here, and I want them to speak to you, and I want them to ask you questions, and I want you to answer it on the show, because this is an interesting topic, and I wish we had more time to dig more into this, but we only have a few minutes left. So I want you to tell us more about the do's and don'ts of the financial aspect of, even in businesses. Now, we've been talking about married couples, but also in businesses, what are the do's and don'ts?
Well, I think a lot of the things that you shouldn't do, the don't is, don't just think you know it all. You need to seek out an expert for these types of things. If you're having financial issues, or you're afraid that you don't have enough money to do something, seek out a financial advisor, seek out a lawyer to help you. It doesn't always have to be a costly process, but you want to get someone who's, who's credible, and you want to ask somebody for a referral source that they've used and they think that that's been a good source for them, because it's complex, and unless this is what you do all the time, you can't understand it, and that's why you want someone who does it all the time. You don't want someone who dabbles in a bunch of different things advising you on what to do with your finances or as part of your marriage or your business. The other thing is to make sure that when you are in a business, for instance, that you, even though you have other people, you may have a company and you have other people running it, a lot of people end up having problems because they just rely on somebody else to run it, and they're out playing golf and doing the things that they've wanted to do, but you can't lose it. It always has to be part of you, and that's what a person has built up, and it's a shame sometimes you see these businesses that are 3 or 4 generations, and it was a great business for a couple of the generations, then maybe the 3rd generation just doesn't get it, and doesn't want it, doesn't know how to do it. You need to bring outsiders in. There's always a hesitance to do that because people feel like sometimes it's a failure. It's not. Nobody can understand everything, and when you're talking about business, there's a lot of experts out there, very well educated, who can help you get to what you need, and you're not expected to know all these things. So I think that's something that people should really think about.
Okay, and now we've given advice on the married couples, and we talked a little about the businesses, but can you give us a scenario of what happens in like the business aspect of, the infidelity?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. I mean, there's.
This is juicy.
Well, look, a lot of it just comes out to be plain fraud, unfortunately.
Oh, wow.
It's fraud of people hiding assets and being in a business. But the business and the personal overlap a lot. I was in a case where the partners were doing due diligence on each other for a transaction they're going to do, and as part of that, it was discovered that one of the partners' wives was having an affair. And so this was something that no one, they were looking at business issues, and this popped up. So, and it was then how to deal with that and what you're going to do. So I kind of go back to the first thing I said, that nothing ever stays a secret, especially in this town. It's never a secret. So things come up and they're exposed. And whether it's business, a lot of times there'll be very, very profitable businesses that someone says, wow, these people, I got to look up to them. And unfortunately, when you talk to them, they don't have a lot of common sense sometimes. And some of the big businesses are, but look at all the issues with the bankruptcies that we've had happening. Lehman and all these different ones where there's always an aspect of greed and somebody doing something they weren't supposed to do. And unfortunately, it's become more and more common. And people just have to look out for that. You just can't, unfortunately, we just can't trust a lot of people. You have to be able to always be on your game and on top of everybody else to make sure. And unfortunately, in relationships, look at all the shows about cheating and private investigators and all these things. It's a shame. And look, I've been married to my husband for 23 years. I love him. I trust him totally. I do trust him totally. But I make sure I have a career. I could take care of myself if something happened. Not that I think it ever would, but you need to understand, just for your own respect too, you need to understand your own finances and what's happening.
Now, I know you got a prenup because you're a lawyer.
I do.
So I'm already knowing that, but what advice do you have? We're about a minute left in the show. What advice do you have for couples that are out there and they're dealing with a prenup? Any last minute
tips? Well, a lot of people think a prenup is offensive and you must not love me because you don't trust me. And it's not fair, especially it's not fair if maybe one of the spouses has been married before and has children, because they need to take care of those children as well. You can be very fair in these agreements. They're up to you to draft them any way you want. You can agree that if there's unfortunately a dissolution at some point, you'll get a certain amount and you'll share the rest, or you won't get anything, but you'll share something that when you sell something. You can do whatever you want, and that's what people need to do. But the part of it, and I've seen relationships end because of this, because one spouse, maybe they've grown up in a wealthy family, and the other person they're marrying hasn't had that luck or that fortune, and they want a prenup. And you can't look at it as lack of trust. You have to look at it as smart business sense. And unfortunately, you got to bring the business into the bedroom. That's part of it.
That makes sense. I want to thank you again. I have to bring you back onto the show.
I'm Robbin Itkin, a financial restructuring expert, and you're watching What's Cooking with Renee.